All right, thanks you all for sticking around. I won't normally do things this way on all our other test days. You'll just have the exam to think about, and you'll have a lot of time. You'll have more time. They'll be a little longer, but you'll have the whole class period to do it. So we fell behind a little bit, so I wanted to take advantage of this 20 minutes or so and see what we can get in. So chapter 12, we are building on, chapter 3, we're talking about prokaryotic, eukaryotic structures. So chapter 12 is just kind of our nod to microscopic eukaryotes. So we're gonna just kind of touch on a few things here, but there's some interesting things to talk about. When we talk about microscopic eukaryotes, of course, we're talking about protozoa, up here, yeast and other fungi. There's lots of fungi that aren't microscopic, but there's yeast and some filamentous fungi that are. And then algae are also microscopic. We don't spend a lot of time on. That's what these two things are, just because they don't typically cause humans any harm. They're not disease causing, with very few exceptions. So that's what we're going to be looking at in chapter 12. We're going to talk kind of basic taxonomy. So what's the difference between plants and fungi? What's the difference between algae and protozoa? Those sorts of things. We're going to spend just a little time on protozoan structures, what all protozoa have in common, and then I want to look at a really interesting protozoa that causes disease, that causes malaria. And then we'll get into a little bit of fungal structures, and really, I used to go into a lot more on fungal reproduction, and the book cut that out, and I was just as glad to do that too. So really kind of a little short study here of our eukaryotes. So I want to talk first about classification. So we said taxonomy is constantly changing as we learn new things. So when Linnaeus, back late 1700s, started organizing everything, he said plants and animals. Okay, that worked for a little while. As of mid 1900s, we were using the kingdom system. So we had the fungi and the protozoa, the plants, animals. Those were all kingdoms. Okay, now because of Woese and Fox's work with studying ribosomal RNA sequences, our taxonomy looks very different. We have all these are correctly called, all of these are correctly called kingdoms now. The problem is those are not generally recognizable. So our book really kind of sticks with this older classification system, just because that's more recognizable. Understand that sometimes an organism that we're talking about doesn't fit precisely into one of these big categories. So, for example, this Stramenophilia, those are organisms that are called water molds. And organisms in that kingdom were responsible for the Great Potato Blight in Ireland in 1800s. What are water molds? They are described as algal protists that act like fungi. Just as an example here. So it's just an example. It doesn't fit quite right. Well, do we call it a protozoa? Do we call it a fungi? What do we call it, an algae? What do we call it exactly? Okay. So going back to our old system, we're just gonna refer to them as protozoa or protists is another name that you hear sometime. What do these organisms generally have in common, realizing there might be an exception here or there? They're eukaryotic and they're single cellular. Okay, so they're microbes, so microbiologists are interested in studying them. Most are motile. So, and in fact, we used to classify them based on their motility structures, whether they had flagella or whether they had cilia or whether they moved by amoeba. We've gotten away from that a little bit, like classifying them that way. But we're not going to worry about that too much. How do they get their nutrients? They get nutrients from organic sources. Okay, and we have a term that we use to describe that, a term that we're going to pick apart in the next lecture when we talk about bacterial nutrition. We call that being chemoheterotrophs. Okay, basically that means they eat stuff. Okay, protozoa, most of them, again, they are ingesting organic nutrients. Some of them, no, we'll say most. Some actually are photosynthetic. Whoops. There, photosynthetic. So there's some variety there. Most of them are free living. But some are parasites. Some are parasitic. Okay, so interestingly enough, you may have heard these terms parasitic and pathogenic. If organisms are eukaryotic, like protozoa, we call them parasites. If organisms cause disease and they're prokaryotic, we call them pathogenic. Okay, so just FYI, if you ever wondered that term, difference between a parasite and a pathogen. So if they're parasitic, though, they're living at the expense of other organisms. So those are the ones that we're kind of interested in for this class. Some examples of protozoa that are parasites, trypanosomes cause African sleeping sickness. This is a picture of a giardia. Interestingly enough, 2 nuclei, kind of looks like eyes there, but it's not. That causes diarrhea if we ingest it. And one that I alluded to that I'm going to talk about, malaria. So the protozoa that causes malaria, we will get to that in just a second. A couple of structures. Protozoa, there's just a lot of, one other thing that I forgot to say that I had mentioned before. I was going to write up here, no cell wall. When we're talking about structures, that reminded me of. Most of them have what we call a pellicle, which is made of protein. Okay, so we're often comparing cell walls of organisms. So I mentioned that previously, but wanted to make note of that again. Lot of variability in structures, or what we call structures when you're talking about protozoan life cycles. All protozoa exist in one stage that we refer to as a trophozoite. And that just means it's their motile feeding stage. Okay, so as an example, I searched the internet to look for an example of a life cycle here. This is an example of a protozoa called Naegleria fowleri. And you probably haven't heard of that, but you may have heard in the news at some point or another of people going swimming and getting this brain-eating protozoal infection. That's Naegleria fowleri. It enters through the nose when somebody's swimming, very rare. But is usually fatal when it has a chance to move to where it causes an infection. And that organism actually has a couple different motile feeding stages, or a couple different forms. It can move by an amoeba in action, or it can have a flagellated form. Okay, so all protozoa have this motile feeding stage. Some of them also can exist as a cyst, and that we'll refer to as a hardy resting stage. Okay, so kind of analogous to the endospore. The way some of our bacteria have this kind of survival mechanism where they can kind of hunker down into almost like a seed almost. Some protozoa can do that as well. It's typically not as hardy as an endospore, not going to be viable for the length of time that we know the endospores can. And only some protozoa can do this. Okay, so I wanted to just bring up an example of a parasitic protozoa because malaria is the biggest threat in terms of infectious disease that Americans have when they're traveling abroad. About half the countries in the world have endemic malaria. So it's something that you may have to try to avoid at some point in your life. Malaria is caused by 5 different species of Plasmodium. Right, so Plasmodium, that's the genus of the organisms that cause malaria. And there's several different species. I don't want you to memorize the species names, but just know that there's a difference in the incubation period of the disease, meaning how long you would start showing symptoms after you were bit by the mosquito, and the severity of the disease. Maybe the one that you've heard of, Plasmodium falciparum, that is the most severe form. And that's the form species that's generally present in sub-Saharan Africa. 90% of all malaria deaths in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the worst form. Probably the second most severe is going to be Plasmodium vivax, and that's present in Latin America and South America. Okay, so South America. And the other ones are more rare, and the disease typically isn't as severe. So how does one get malaria? Well, they're carried, part of the life cycle of the Plasmodium has to take place inside these Anopheles mosquitoes. And there's a lot of different species, so it's certain species of Anopheles mosquitoes. And it's only the females that bite humans that take blood meals because they need that blood to for the nutrients for their eggs. Okay, so the males don't bite us at all. We have the kind of mosquitoes that transmit malaria in this country. Right now, they are not transmitting malaria, but they have in the past. Back in the 1800s they did, and they could again, especially as our climate warms a little bit. So interesting thought. Right now, there's usually only around 1,000 to 2,000 cases in the US a year, and they're all people that have traveled in other countries and come into the US. The Plasmodium does not harm the mosquito, unfortunately. If it did, then we wouldn't have as much problem with it. But the mosquitoes, just again, part of the life cycle of the Plasmodium happens in the mosquito. What does the disease look like? Because probably most of us have never encountered anybody with malaria. It's a cyclic disease. So every maybe 6 to 10 hours, one goes through these 3 different stages, and then those 3 stages are repeated every couple days. It starts out with a cold stage. So the patient is shivering, have the chills, okay, maybe shaking a little bit. And that progresses into a hot stage where the patient has a high fever. They may be vomiting, severe headache. And then after a few hours, that fever breaks and the patient is sweating. Okay, but again, the temperature normal. Patient sweats and has extreme fatigue. Okay, so when I read that first, I thought, well, that kind of sounds like the flu. You know, we've all had that. That doesn't sound that bad. there's a lot of complications to this. I had a friend that came back from Africa and he had neurological complications. He was in a coma for about a week and they didn't think he was going to make it, and he did. But there can be neurological complications. Kidneys sometimes shut down. Anemia is pretty common because, as we'll see, this can infect the red blood cells, does infect the red blood cells. So anemia is common. And I've read descriptions from people that have had this and they've said, I just wanted to die. I was in the worst pain that I've ever been in. So it's pretty serious. Most of the fatalities will occur in children under 5. But adults can succumb to this as well, and they can get it over and over again. It's not something that you get once and you never get again. So really important to try to mitigate the presence of these mosquitoes. We have, with pesticides and nets. I'm not going to get into the treatment just because I don't want to take a whole lot of time to do that. But when we take medications, when we travel to try to keep us from getting malaria, sometimes we can't tolerate those medications very well. Sometimes they make us nauseous and then people don't want to take them. So that's not perfect. The drugs we have aren't perfect. There's a lot of resistance. There is a vaccine now that was just approved by the WHO this year. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later when we talk about our vaccines. It's not a great vaccine, but it's only supposed to reduce severe malaria in about 30% of the kids that get it. Right now they're giving it to kids. It doesn't seem great, but if you save 30% of the lives of kids that get it, then that sounds a lot better. So I just want to briefly talk about the life cycle. And I know this looks terribly complicated because it is. We've had malaria or known about malaria for thousands of years, literally, and we just kind of figured out the life cycle in the last maybe 120 years or so. So because it is incredibly complicated, we have a different name for all the different stages of the life cycle. I just want you to understand the basics. So if we start right here, this is where a mosquito that has been infected with Plasmodium bites a human or takes a blood meal. Okay, so when they take the blood meal, they inject some anticoagulants, and that is what contains the Plasmodium. The first place that those Plasmodium go, they infect our hepatocytes. Okay, so there's a portion of their life cycle that matures in our liver. And then when, don't worry about the names of these stages or whatever, but when they are mature, then they will enter our red blood cells. Okay, so human blood stages. And that's where it's doing all the damage. That's where you have all the disease manifestations, because this is the trophozoite. Remember, that's the motile feeding stage, destroying our red blood cells. So at this point, if a mosquito that's not infected takes a blood meal from the infected human, now the Plasmodium is going to be able to mature in that mosquito. You can see there's a cyst stage that can happen there, and then just the process repeats. So somewhere between 400 and 500,000 lives lost every year due to malaria. Just as a fun aside, so you have something interesting to talk about at your dinner table tonight. This is on the Gates website, the next slide that I'm going to show you. So if you think about what's the world's deadliest animal, so we could argue over what's considered an animal and what's not, but world's deadliest animal. So I think maybe lions, or, I hear hippos are really mean, maybe hippos. Well, somebody's taken the time to, put together whatever statistics we have. Thinking about the world's deadliest animal, yeah, lions made the list, and hippos. Kind of surprisingly, dogs. 25,000 people worldwide killed by dogs. It's because of rabies. Right, we have rabies controlled really well in this country, but not so much in other countries. there's a second page. Snakes made the list. 50,000 people killed by snakes. Let's not forget humans. Okay, almost 500,000 people kill other people. But the biggest, most deadliest by far, mosquito. Somewhere around 700,000 lives lost. So again, a little more than half of those is because of malaria, but mosquitoes carry like 14 other diseases, all viral except malaria. Things like dengue and chikungunya and West Nile and Zika and yellow fever and Eastern equine encephalitis. So there's a whole big list of them. It's been suggested that we would be better off without mosquitoes, that they are not important in any animal's food chain, and that we should just totally eradicate them and we would be better off. So interesting to me to think about that. Do you have questions, comments? Okay. Algae. We are just going to spend a minute on algae. Although they are essential to food chains and essential for making oxygen, they, again, don't really cause disease, so we're not going to be that interested in them for this class. But you should kind of know their characteristics, their eukaryotes, they photosynthesize. There's a lot of variety. Some of them live as single cells, like this is a marine diatom. Some of them live colonially, like the volvox. I talked about that in biology at some point. Or they can be multicellular, like this is red algae. That's where we get augurs in the cell walls of red algae. Here's some giant brown kelp, miles and miles in the ocean, lots of brown kelp. So, and very different cell wall composition. Some don't have a cell wall, some have silica. That's what diatoms, they have silica in their cell walls. Lots of different things in their cell walls. So what's the difference, which this is just kind of, if you're interested, what's the difference between algae and plants? It's not that just that algae are small plants, because like I said, the brown kelp, miles and miles across the ocean. If you're interested, the difference is in the reproduction, and you can't necessarily tell that by looking at an organism. But in algae, all of the reproductive structure has the potential to become a gamete. For in plants, that's not the case. So again, kind of FYI in case you're interested there. And I will close with today. So what is plankton? Another, just kind of, the more you know, right? From SpongeBob, you might think, well, is this a bacteria or a protozoa or maybe an algae? I don't really know. Anybody know what a plankton is? It is defined as a microscopic organism that lives in a large body of water. Okay, so that could be an algae, it could be a bacteria, it could be an archaea, it could be a protozoa, it could be any of those things. So just in case you wondered. All right, we'll finish with fungi and get into chapter 6 on Monday. I will have those exams for posted by tonight, hopefully.